Continuing with our section on rereading Hamlet, we are going to look at another character. So from Ophelia, we are moving on to another character, that is King Claudius. And who was Claudius? Claudius was Hamlet's uncle who got married to his mother after the death of his father. That's our understanding. I mean, that is there in the original story. Now, in this poem, what Constantine P. Covey is doing is he is imagining as to what really happened in the story. And who is this man, Claudius? We see him as a villain in the original story. He is the villain of the piece. He was responsible for the murder of Hamlet's father. Then he married his mother, thereby committing incest and driving Hamlet mad. And finally, we know he is killed. He is killed by Hamlet towards the end. So we see him as a villain of the story. But is that the reality? Is there something more than that meets the eye? These are some of the questions taken up by Kavafi in this poem. So you get an alternate retelling, a rereading of the character of Claudius. So the circumstance is such wherein you have the poet, he's taking a walk. He's going to Elsinore. Elsinore is a city where Hamlet was. I mean, it's a city in Denmark. The story of Hamlet is set in Denmark. So the poet is taking a walk along the streets of Denmark, and he happens to overhear the people, the common ordinary people of Denmark, speak in hushed tones about King Claudius. And from these conversations, he happens to overhear these conversations, and from that, he comes to know about a different side, a different story altogether about Claudius. So, Claudius is not what has been projected by Shakespeare in the real story, according to this particular retelling. So, we find a total different perspective on Claudius. So, we get to see a very different person, a very different way of looking at the whole story of Hamlet. And here, Constantine Cavafy, he was a Greek poet who spent quite a lot of time in Great Britain, and then it gave him a lot of, you could say, joy in rereading many of these texts. I've already shared an article with you. You can just read that and supplement your understanding of this particular poem, wherein the poem can also be seen from a post colonial perspective. But we'll not be getting into that here because for us, the purpose is to do a comparative reading. A comparative reading, as in you're going to compare and then you're going to look at this rereading. So these two poems that have been prescribed in this section is a rereading of Hamlet. So one from the perspective of Ophelia, a feminist take, and this one is a retelling or a rereading of a villainous character. So is there a possibility of goodness in somebody who has already been painted as a villain? That's a question he's trying to answer. All right, so let's begin. King Claudius by C.P. Cavafy. My mind now moves to distant places. I'm walking the streets of Elsinore through the squares, and I recall the very sad story that unfortunate king killed by his nephew because of some fanciful suspicions. So now the poet, what is he saying? I'm walking the streets of Elsinore, and my mind is now moving to distant places. So he's undertaking this journey, so a literal journey as well as a mental journey. So he's walking the streets of Elsinore. Elsinore is the city in Denmark, where Hamlet's palace was. All right. So he's walking the streets of Elsinore, walking through its squares, and I recall the very sad story. So as I'm walking along Elsinore, I'm remembering that very sad story of that unfortunate king killed by his nephew because of some fanciful suspicion. So he's thinking about that unfortunate king killed by the nephew. So the unfortunate king is nothing, I mean, none other than King Claudius. So he's calling him unfortunate, and he was killed by his nephew Hamlet. And why did he kill him? Because of some fanciful suspicions. Because the nephew had some suspicion about his uncle, and that's why he was killed. That's why he was killed. I hope this much is clear to you. Now, what is this fanciful suspicion he's talking about? If you remember the story of Hamlet, it would tell you that Hamlet was visited by his dead father's ghost, and the ghost had exhorted him to take revenge and kill his uncle. And uncle was responsible for his murder. I mean, that's what the king's ghost had told Hamlet. Fine, but now you're seeing the other side. So now, what had happened when he went walking around the streets of Elsinore? In all the homes of the poor, he was mourned secretly. They were afraid of Fortinbras. So now, after the death of Claudius, all the poor people in the country, they mourned. They mourned for the death of King Claudius. So this shows that King Claudius was very good to the poor people. So he was an excellent ruler who took care of the poor people. So this is also something very new, which is not there in Shakespeare. So in all the homes of the poor, he was mourned secretly. All the poor people, they cried for him. They felt very sad about him, and they observed that mourning, and it was done secretly. Why was this done secretly? They did not tell it in the open. They did not make it public that they are really sorrowful at the death of their king. They mourned secretly. Why? Because they were afraid of Fortinbras. Now, Fortinbras is the king, or the next king. That is, after the death of Claudius, the next king was Fortinbras. Hamlet did not become the king because Hamlet also got killed in a duel. So at the end of Hamlet, there's a lot many deaths and murders, double crossing, cheating, because of which so many lives are lost. Along with that, even Hamlet dies in the end. So the next king was Fortinbras. So now Fortinbras was a very dominating, commanding, scary kind of a person. So people were scared of him, and poor people, they mourned for the dead king in secret. They did not make public. They did not show their anguish and their sympathies for the dead king in public because they were afraid of the next king. A quiet gentleman, a man who loved peace. So, this is totally a different picture of Claudius. So, what was Claudius like? He was a quiet man, he was a very quiet, he was a gentleman, a man who loved peace. He was a very peaceful person, a peace loving man. His country had suffered much from the wars of his predecessor. His predecessor, the king before him, was his own brother. So the country had suffered quite a lot when his brother was on the throne because he undertook many expeditions and many wars, which led to the common people suffering quite a lot. So the country had enough of suffering during his brother's reign. But when he became the king, that is when Claudius became the king, things were very peaceful. He was peaceful and he loved peace, because of which he was able to establish peace in his kingdom. He behaved graciously toward everyone, humble and great alike. So we find in him a very democratic kind of a ruler, somebody who treated everyone equally. Class did not matter to him. So whether you're poor or you're rich, everybody was the same for Claudius. That's why we have here the poor people mourning for him. So he was someone who treated everyone equally. He was very, very peace loving. So you have the picture of a perfect gentleman, somebody who was really good at heart and also a very good ruler, somebody who was loved by his people. So he was very gracious towards everyone, humble and great alike. Never high handed, he always sought advice in the kingdom's affairs from serious, experienced people. So he was never high handed. That is, he did not make use of or he did not throw around his weight. Being the king, obviously, you will have a lot of power. You can do whatever you want, whatever you please. But he never did that. He was never high handed. He always took the advice of serious and experienced people, that is the elder people in the court. So he took advice from the experienced people in all matters of the kingdom. So when he had to run the kingdom, he sought the opinion of all these people. So this shows a very democratic as well as a very, you could say, a republic kind of a kingdom, wherein all these people were consulted. So a very parliamentary, democratic kind of a kingdom was established under the rule of King Claudius. So these things being said, reiterated again, is pointing towards a time when things were different. That is, when his brother was there, things were not like this. So a total contrast. The previous one got into all kinds of war, all kinds of disturbances, and maybe there was this difference between the rich and the poor. But he did not consult the elders and the experienced people. Those things hadn't happened. But now, during the time of Claudius, this was how the kingdom was run, and everybody was happy. So he took advice from serious, experienced people. Just why his nephew killed him was never actually explained. So everything was going so well. Everyone was happy. There was nothing wrong with him or the kingdom or the way he was running the show. Everything was fine. But then the writer is saying that it just beats me. I just don't understand just why his nephew killed him was never actually explained. So nobody really knew the truth. Actually, why this uncle Claudius was killed by his nephew, that is Hamlet. That why did he kill when things were going so smooth and things were all so good? So there's a gaping hole there. There's some secret, there's some kind of a mystery associated with the death. We don't know exactly what happened. The prince suspected him of murder, and the basis of his suspicion was this. Walking one night along an ancient battlement, he thought he saw a ghost, and he had a conversation with this ghost. What he supposedly heard from the ghost were certain accusations against the king. So now, what is told by people in the kingdom as to what had happened? That is, the prince suspected him of murder. So the prince, as in Hamlet, he doubted his uncle of murder. And what was the basis of this doubt? That one night, he was walking along an ancient battlement. He was walking along the battlement, that is where the soldiers are. You have the army and all positioned in a particular area. So he was walking along an ancient battlement. He thought he saw a ghost, and he started talking with the ghost. He had a conversation with this ghost, and what he supposedly heard from the ghost were certain accusations against the king. So he happened to see a ghost, he had a talk with the ghost, and the ghost told certain accusations. So the ghost told him some things. So what were the things told by the ghost? We'll come to that later. It must have been a fit of fancy, an optical illusion. The prince was nervous in the extreme. While he was studying at Wittenberg, many of his fellow students thought him a maniac. But then the poet is telling us that the fact or the way it was reported that he had seen a ghost and the ghost had told him about the murder and the ghost had let him in about what had happened, it could have been a fit of fancy. Maybe he was frenzied, he was in a state of mental disturbance. It could have been an optical illusion. Optical illusion is wherein you see things that are not there. Sometimes your eyes can play games with you, wherein you see things that are not there. So if you're in the under the influence of some drugs, or when you're mentally really disturbed, or when you're really scared, you see things that are not there in reality. So it could have been just a fit of fancy, not a reality. So maybe there was no ghost, nothing. And also we know that the prince was in a very nervous state. He was actually a nervous wreck at that time. He was nervous in the extreme, and this was reported when he was studying at Wittenberg. So even before coming back to England, please remember that Hamlet was a student at a German university at Wittenberg, the University of Wittenberg, which is in Germany. He was studying there, and it was due after he got the news of his death that he comes to England. So it was reported by his fellow students, his classmates, that he already was mentally disturbed. He was a nervous wreck. So he had some problem. So maybe that nervousness must have added or led to him having this hallucination, wherein he saw things which others could not see, but then he believed in, and he saw, he could talk to these things, whatever. But then maybe he was in a state of hallucination, that extreme mental stress or mental disturbance during which you see things, you hear things that others cannot do. And then what happened? A few days later, he went to his mother's room to discuss certain family affairs. And suddenly, while he was talking, he lost his self control, started shouting, screaming that the ghost was there in front of him. So, another reason now given to prove that there was something wrong with him mentally is that a few days later, that is after the death of his father, and he was back in England, what happened? He went to his mother's room, Gertrude's room, Queen Gertrude's room, to discuss some family affairs. And all of a sudden, what happened? He started yelling and shouting. Till then, he was being very normal, talking to the mother. Things were going normally. And all of a sudden, what happened? He lost self control. He started shouting and screaming. And what did he say? That there was a ghost in front of him. So he said that his father was standing in front of him. But then his mother saw nothing at all. The mother, who's normal, she could not see anything. And that same day, for no apparent reason, he killed an old gentleman of the court. So that very same day, that very same time, what happened in the real story? He says that there is a rat hiding behind the curtain. Actually, it was Polonius, uh, gentleman of the court, standing there and spying and trying to overhear what Hamlet was saying, because Hamlet was acting like a very weird, detached in the court. So these people were after spying after him, trying to understand what was the reality. So Polonius was hiding behind the curtain, and Hamlet understood that. And what does he do? He simply jumps and then he takes out a sword and he hits out. I mean, he kind of stabs the curtain, saying that he's trying to kill a rat. But then in reality, who gets killed? Who was hiding behind the curtains? It was Polonius. So he was saying, now the poet is telling us that at that same day he was shouting and screaming, and then, and for no apparent reason, that is, there was no serious reason. You don't kill rats like that, right? That's not the way. So it was a very deliberate attempt by him. So by quite deliberately and for no apparent reason, he killed an old gentleman of the court. And old gentleman here refers to Polonius. Polonius is Ophelia's father. Please remember that. Since the prince was due to sail for England in a day or two, the king hustled him off post haste in order to save him. So the prince was supposed to go to, due to he was due to sail for England in a day or two. The king hustled him off post haste in order to save him. So that is from Elsinore, that is from Denmark. He was supposed to go to England. So these things are happening in Denmark. So from there he was supposed to go to England. So now the king, he wanted to save him. Otherwise, what would have happened? He would have tried for the murder of Polonius. So in order to save him, he was in a hurry, packed off, and sent to England. But the people were so outraged by the monstrous murder that rebels rose up and tried to storm the palace gates, led by the dead man's son, the noble Lord Leatus, a brave young man, also ambitious. In the confusion, some of his friends called out, "Long live King Leatus." So, but then what happened after the murder? The people in the country, they were very, very angry. They were outraged at this monstrous murder. You don't murder anybody just like that, saying that you doubted that it was a rat. That's not how things are done. And the people were so angry. So there was this group of rebels who rose up against Hamlet. So they tried to storm the palace gate. So they tried to attack and get inside the palace gate. They wanted to punish Hamlet. And this uprising, this rebellion was led by the dead man's son, Leatus. Leatus is Ophelia's brother. And in the bracket, you see Leotus, who was a brave young man. He was also very ambitious. So he had a lot of followers, a lot of supporters, and these supporters, and in the confusion, it was kind of a melee wherein all these people were coming in, shouting, screaming, barging inside the palace, trying to get hold of Hamlet. And in the confusion, what some of his friends called out, "Long live King Leotus!" So he was such an ambitious and a man, brave young man, that he was an equal opponent for Hamlet, thereby as good as a prince, as good as the next king. So he had so much of backing that his supporters called out, "Long live King Leotus." So this shows an alternative that could have happened. That is, if Hamlet had not been around, then for sure the people would have elected him as the king, because he was much more worthier than Hamlet. He had much more backing and support compared to Hamlet. So Hamlet was not that well liked by the people of Denmark.